His love for and romanticization of Paris is rivaled only, I think, by Emily Cooper. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf. This is going to be a really, really fun video, at least for me, because I get to just sit here and talk about one of those experiences along the journey of a lifetime reader that sort of put a stake in the ground, sort of put a touchstone there on the side of the path. It's an event, as you have seen at the in the little splash clip at the beginning of this video. I like that quote from Stendhal. And I felt it was very apt for today's video because reading Victor Hugo, reading Les Misérables, it's an event. It's not just mere passing of the time or entertainment, or you've got a long flight or a long vacation and so you want to sink into a book, or maybe more relevant to something like this particular book, you're trying to be a good human and a good citizen and get around to those books that, through some kind of crazy cultural osmosis, we grow up knowing we're supposed to read, right? We know we're supposed to read War and Peace. We know we're supposed to read The Count of Monte Cristo. We know we're supposed to read Les Misérables, Moby Dick, on and on and on, right? And so sometimes people will get into those modes, and normally what happens, I think, to the majority of us is we either, one, buy an abridged edition, two, liberally skim, such as the people who skip all the essays and skip all the war parts in War and Peace, so they effectively read Tolstoy's Peace. Or we cast the book aside and swear that the classics just aren't for us, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that I sought out an unabridged version because, in general, I just really, I revere and respect artists. And so, to me, if the conception that Hugo had, and by the way, I'm probably going to interchangeably say Hugo and Hugo. If the original conception he had was for the book to be 1,400 pages, which is close to what this is, then that's the book, then that's actually the book that Hugo wrote, right? So the abridgment is not his book. Of course, in the same way that a translation can be said to not be his book. When I was recently on the Zoom party for the literary prize, The Republic of Consciousness, I really liked how Rodrigo Frezan was very adamant that the translator of his book Melville, Will Vanderheyden, read instead of Frezan reading, because Frezan insisted this is Will's book. I did not write this book. I wrote, the Spanish one, but Will wrote the English one. So you can make that. But all I'm saying is that, I want the unabridged version. And as I said, maybe in my first video of this year, I was so surprised at how readable this is, how wonderful it is. It is so well written. This is the Christine Donougher. I'm sure there's some cool way to pronounce it. To me, it just comes out Christine Donougher. With an introduction by Robert Toombs, whom we'll hear from, old Robbie Toombs. here at the beginning. And by the way, I'm sorry, I'm a little rambly right now. I am actually fresh back from Paris. I am in the throes of jet lag, but I also picked up some nice little sinus bug on the plane in an act that I like to think would please Victor Hugo greatly. I gave up my seat that I had used points to achieve, where there was an unbelievable amount of legroom. It wasn't an exit row. It was just an unbelievable amount of legroom on this Air France plane. Well, I gave up my seat for a very elderly and fragile woman so that she could sit beside her son, who was actually seated beside me. I moved 5 rows back. No big deal. I was like, I love doing that kind of stuff, and I know this sounds self-congratulatory, but the irony, the Seinfeld episode that turned out of it was that the guy beside me was hacking up both lungs the entire trip. And I just remember sitting there thinking, I mean, how could I even be upset or irritated by this? Because it's just, something right out of a sitcom, right? And then the other thought I had was, well, there goes the next few days for me as far as health. But this is just part of traveling. You catch little bugs and stuff. So anyway, I am jet lagged. I am doing this video as early in the morning as I could possibly stand it, so that you'll get the best of me. So I apologize that it's going to be a little rambly, and is a little rambly here in the beginning. I have no clue how to get back to what I was just saying, but here's the cool thing. For this video, the way we're going to approach it, listen, I read this book back in July of 2024 because I wanted to read it before going to Paris for the very first time in October of last year. And then I read the Victor Hugo biography by Robb. This book, the introductory matter, actually pointed to this as like the choice first biography. And it's wonderful. I didn't read this though until January of this year. And so now we're toward the end, we're at the end of March here, beginning of April, but all of it is so fresh on my mind because this is just a powerful book. It's so powerfully written. And, I just want to sit here and let the notes that I took, the things that stood out to me, sort of guide me. So as I normally do, I'm going to go through, read things that stood out to me, and then just sort of let that prompt my own personal commentary for this video. One other thing I'd like to point out that I can make relevant to this video, but that I feel I've never shared before, is that this red fox here, Vulpes, his name is Shakespeare. So a lot of people have been seeing him. I just want everyone to know that his name is Shakespeare. He's a dear friend of mine, and he actually watches over all the books when I'm not here. So let's just give it up for Shakespeare. Okay, that was odd. The way I'll connect that is to say that Victor Hugo had this device. This is for real. He had this device that allowed him to communicate with the dead. And one of the people with whom he communicated was William Shakespeare. And in fact, Shakespeare dictated an entire brand new play, curiously, in Victor Hugo's French. And Victor Hugo took it down. I don't think that has been handed down to us. But the other thing is that Victor Hugo's son was actually a big time translator of Shakespeare's complete works, and Hugo was going to write a preface to that, and ended up writing this enormous biography of Shakespeare instead that was just riddled with factual errors and all kinds of stuff. He did end up writing a more proper intro, but there's some funny stuff there. Anyway, let's get started. As usual, I've got these sort of summary statements here, and then we'll get into it. But first, I just want to say again that this reading experience was one of the greatest reading experiences of my life. Honestly, here I am, 40 years old. Well, I was 39 technically when I read Les Mis, but now I'm 40. I'm finally getting around to reading it. Unexpurgated edition. I highly recommend. Many notable affinities with the Unexpurgated War and Peace, and definitely this book is up there on that stature. You know, it's the loose baggy monster that it's of the loose baggy monsters ilk that Henry James was talking about, but I wouldn't consider it a loose baggy monster at all. It has everything in it, honestly, and it just emotionally, it's amazing. You know, I was reminded often that Hugo started as a poet, and he was like an avatar of a new strain of romanticism there in France. And of course, you know, we had romanticism was born out of Jena in Germany in the previous century, and then took hold in Britain, and then finally, you know, in France. But he wrote so much poetry, and in fact, he's still pretty much considered like France's national poet, the way that Russia would consider Pushkin the national poet, sort of that symbol of culture and poetry. And it's just amazing being there and seeing Hugo's presence still in Paris. And, you know, I got to go and visit his apartment there in the Place des Vosges twice now. This previous time, I got some video footage, so I'll run that. But just looking around, you know, this guy, this is where you have a human who was so oversized in every way and in every aspect, and really was able to put in the work, sort of, what should I say, harness, temper the genius. And of course, there are sordid means by which I think, you know, he strove to harness his genius in such a way to where he could produce something lasting. And he did that with Les Misérables. And it's just such an engrossing book. I read it with a French friend of mine. He read it in the original French. I read it in the Donougher translation, and we both just marveled at the just intensity and power of the book. And I mean, when certain people die, you feel such a palpable, sharp sense of grief. It's just incredible. But let's go ahead and get started. This has certainly got to be the most belabored introductory remarks or whatever to any video I've ever done. I am so sorry. I promise I'll start getting focused. So let's dive in. Victor Marie Hugo. He was a philosopher, a poet, a storyteller, a politician, and, of course, an insatiable Lothario. As a novelist, and chiefly in Les Mis, I'm going to say Les Mis here and there just to shorten it all, he was a master of conflict and emotion, and of course, the moral dilemma. I mean, and what's so remarkable, I think, about this book is that probably going into it, this was true for me, but going into it and as you're reading it, it does encompass so many cliches, so many generic cliches of a book from the 19th century, let's say, of a social novel from the 19th century. It has a lot of the stock characters and the cliches and stock situations, that you would expect. But it's just different here. I've read my Tolstoy, I've read my Dickens, Balzac, who else? Thackeray. Who else comes to mind? Fielding. But something is just different with Hugo. He raises it to another level. So much so that even when things are over-explained by today's standards, he really seeks to keep the reader engaged and informed, even when things tend to be over-explained by our standards. There's a charisma or something in there that just sweeps you along with it. At least that was true for me. Anyway, I won't belabor the point. His life and work certainly cast an enormously long shadow over French literature in the manner of Homer over Greece and Shakespeare over England and Dante over Italy, Goethe, Germany, Cervantes, Spain, and of course, as I've been saying, Tolstoy, Russia. His love for and romanticization of Paris is rivaled only, I think, by Emily Cooper. As Melville puts it in Moby Dick, to produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme. And indeed, thus Victor Hugo, writing from his exile on Guernsey in the English Channel Islands, he says, as long as there are ignorance and poverty on earth, books of this kind may serve some purpose. And he also said that the book had progress as its summit. I think fraternity as its foundation and progress as its summit. But certainly, he's taking on Napoleon, the French Revolution, Waterloo, social injustice, these big, mighty themes. We'll get more into details as we go on. Social injustice is the mighty theme of Les Mis, and Hugo not only offers practical changes, radical though they may be, he cements a story that continues to seize the hearts of readers around the world, or people who go and see the Broadway production, or people who watch one of the many film adaptations or stage plays. Reading Les Mis is a major event in one's life, not just because it's long, of course. I read this dutifully, exclusively, furious. I could not put it down. I just drank it in, but it still took me like a month and a half to get through it, even at that pace. And it's not dense. I wouldn't consider this dense. Although, as a friend and I were talking about yesterday, after reading Michael Brodsky's In Viticum, my definition of density in literature is completely changed. There are many books now that I would have called dense before that are fast food now. But yeah, not only because it's long, but it's a major event in one's life, because if you read this book, if you engage with this book, you cannot fail to be changed inexorably. It cannot fail to leave its mark on you. I think about the principles in this book very, very often. I mean, even like I said, when I gave up my luxurious seat for this woman, this elderly woman, to come and sit beside her son so that he could care for her during the long flight, I thought of Monseigneur Bienvenu, and what he would have done from Les Mis. Yeah, and lastly, I think that it asks, it presses us to face three major questions that the way in which we answer or choose not to answer these three questions will completely determine the outcome of your life. So one is, what can we put our faith in? Faith is shaken by so many things in this novel. And I'll try to hold off. We'll get into details later. Two, what does it mean to be free? Can we be free? You think of Rousseau's social contract and his famous statement in that text that, man is born free, yet is everywhere in chains. But yeah, what does it really mean to be free? And then finally, can a person truly change? Another thing to note is that, and I started to get into it, but there were three major revolutions in France. Of course, the revolution, what we are talking about when we say the revolution, and we think about the storming of the Bastille and, Danton and Robespierre and all that whole, the guillotine, is the revolution of 1789. And certainly that's one of the topics in here. And Hugo is reflecting on that. He was born in 1802. We'll find out in a second. He was born in 1802, so he wasn't even alive during the revolution. But the current events that happen in here, the revolution that happens in here, is actually a minor revolution. The other of the three big ones is the July Revolution of 1830. Well, first of all, the revolution also gave rise to Napoleon, who features in here, that's just a whole crazy story, and he reflects a lot on Napoleon. And then there's the July Revolution of 1830, the Three Glorious Days. This is the overthrow of King Charles the Tenth, the establishment of the July monarchy under Louis Philippe. But then the next and last big revolution is the French Revolution of 1848. And this was the establishment of the Second Republic. But in between, just before that, there was the June Rebellion, or the Paris Uprising of 1832. And that is what is depicted in here with Gavroche and Marius and so on. This was the rebellion of the Republicans against the Louis Philippe monarchy. So the outspoken Lamarck died, and after his funeral, that's when the Republicans rose up and, famously built their barricades in the streets and so on. And that, the 1832 uprising, is what is depicted in Les Misérables. And certainly Victor Hugo was a part of that, being 30 years old and very well established. Okay, so let's hear a little bit of introductory information. This is the Robert Toombs introduction to this penguin. How long is this thing? The text itself, by the way, and the font is rather small, to be honest. It's 1,304 pages. So this is a 1,300 page book, and just wonderful. And it fell apart. The glue, I left it in my car because I read this in July last year, and like the glue melted just enough to let these pages loose, and then I brought it inside, and the glue congealed again. I should have left them. I should have left the pages in there. Anyway, here we go. Yeah, this is great from Robert Toombs, talking about Victor Hugo. He was one of those bushy, bearded 19th century monsters of egotism, energy, and creativity. Several contemporaries compared him with that other domineering genius, Wagner. Tolstoy bracketed him with Dostoevsky. In British terms, we would have to think of him as Dickens, Tennyson, and Carlyle rolled into one. The greatest popular novelist, the greatest modern poet, and the irrepressible conscience of the nation. It really is remarkable, all the different roles that he fulfilled, and on such a large stage at that. He was a crusading enemy of the death penalty, an implacable opponent of tyranny, a parliamentarian under three different regimes, and a patriotic bard. Yet, as seems to always be the thing with these great men, these big geniuses, right? He was a danger to those around him, blighting the lives of most of his family, and an incorrigible and insatiable sex pest, specializing in vulnerable women amenable to his fame, money, and patriarchal authority. Waterloo was a turning point in French and European history and fundamental to the plot of Les Mis. And we'll see that he goes to great pains. Don't fear the Waterloo section. It's wonderful. And one of the things that makes it wonderful is Hugo sets himself up with the task of, how should I put it? Well, we'll get to it in a little bit. But in sum, he wants to sort of rewrite the story for us and show that the French actually didn't lose at Waterloo. Let's put it that way. Victor Hugo came to prominence during the 1820s as a brilliant young royalist poet, proclaiming that poetry required monarchist ideas and religious beliefs, and happy to turn out odes on royal occasions and denounce Buonaparte in verse. And I pronounce it that way, even though that's not quite right, because as you'll see in the text, when people wanted to denounce Napoleon, they would often not call him Bonaparte or Bonaparte, but Buonaparte, kind of, and spell it and really emphasize his Corsican Italian roots, as if to say, he's not even French. He was elected in 1841 to the Academy, the Académie Française, the pinnacle of the intellectual establishment, and in 1845 given a peerage by Louis Philippe with a seat in the upper chamber. Hugo began writing his own social novel, provisionally titled Jean Très Jean, and later Valjean, and finally Valjean, on the 17th of November, 1845, and retitled it Les Misérables by 48, when most of the book was in draft. He spent 18 of his most superhumanly productive years in exile, first in Jersey and then in Guernsey at Hauteville House. And he became a worldwide celebrity. So while he was in exile, he was still cranking out all kinds of work. His work is vast. It's so much larger than we in the English-speaking world even realize. Get this, it's very Tolstoy-esque as well. He invented a new religion, and it's still practiced in Vietnam. And he experimented with spiritualism in order to communicate with other great men. Napoleon I indicated his approval of Hugo's opposition to his nephew, that is Joseph, I think, Napoleon the Third, or Le Petit, Napoleon Petit, as Hugo would call him. Where are we? And Shakespeare dictated a new play, which I mentioned just a bit ago. Also, that I mentioned, his son, Francois Victor, translated the complete works of Shakespeare, to which Hugo contributed a book-length introduction. He turned to pacifism, continued to campaign against the death penalty, and dreamed of a united Europe that would inevitably have Paris as its capital. I think the he here is Napoleon, or maybe Hugo himself. I lost a little bit of the context here, but he had won Waterloo in two ways. First, he portrayed it. Oh yeah, Hugo himself won Waterloo. First, he portrayed it as a moral victory for the French, for the circumstances that caused them to lose were providential. God had ended the reign of the individual genius. So, secondly, Hugo won Waterloo by detaching it from the Bonapartist legend and attaching it to the revolution and the republic. So, yeah, like I said, we get into that, and that's part of what makes the Waterloo section so interesting. The circumstances in which he began Les Misérables in Paris were in most ways very different from those in which he finished it 16 years later at Waterloo, like literally there at the battleground. Hugo considered the title, Les Misérables, untranslatable. The closest English rendering is the wretches or the wretched, conveying both pity and condemnation. So, meaning like for the poor, there's pity. For the wretched, there's condemnation. So both of these together, the misère. In the 1840s, when he began thinking and writing about this, there was no question more urgent than revolution. But how could revolution be made to serve civilization rather than barbarism? When would the people be its noble patriotic self rather than a debased and destructive mob which is traitor to the people? As Toome says, Hugo's solution relates not to sociology or ideology, but to morality. When inspired and educated to do good, they were the people. When debased and corrupted, they were the mob. This is one of the fundamental themes of Les Misérables, which he described as a sort of social epic. So yeah, like I said, it's got everything, and different things are highlighted. Most people know, Jean Valjean is imprisoned for a long time after stealing a loaf of bread for his sister's family, and then gets out and then is pursued by Javert, right? And there's all these love stories and social injustices, and I mean, it's vast. There's so much to it. In Hugo's mind, he says suffering cannot disappear. Like he's aware that to suffer is to be human, but la misère must disappear, meaning poverty and condemnation must disappear. He truly believed that if we could eradicate those two things, poverty and condemnation, humankind, and it might take a little while to iron out, but humankind would be so much better in the end. And this is embodied, these like grace and mercy. These principles are embodied chiefly in Monseigneur Bienvenu, and then passed on through Jean Valjean. And we imagine that Marius will be the final successor of such a lifestyle and such faith. All right, let's see. Okay, so in 1833, Hugo spent his first night with the actress Juliette Drouet, and he says, "When I awoke to love," and then began a liaison that lasted for 50 years. He was effectively like married to two women. I mean, there was Adele, Madame Hugo, but Juliette Drouet was his mistress, but they were aware of each other, and it's complicated. Blah, blah, blah. In 1843, Hugo had learned that his daughter Leopoldine had been drowned. At one level, the novel, Les Mis, is a vast attempt by Hugo to make sense of his own life and its passing in a Paris that was disappearing during his exile. From the time of its publication, if not even before, it was a huge bestseller, building on Hugo's literary and political fame. The Lord of Human Tears was at least the equal of his contemporary Dickens as an impresario of emotion. I love that. Nonetheless, the book was banned by the Vatican and burned in Spain. And, France being such a Catholic country, but Hugo had no time for it. He did not, he believed in and revered God, but he did not like Catholicism. He made that very well known. And in fact, as we'll find out here in a little bit, I think from the Graham Robb, and this gives you an idea of Hugo's fame in his lifetime. For his funeral procession, they deconsecrated the Pantheon so that he, a non-Catholic, could be buried there. And it's just amazing. And the population of France, of Paris, doubled. And people filled the streets and followed the funeral procession to the Pantheon, where he was laid to rest. And when I went to Paris back in October, I did go down into the crypt and see his tomb. So it's wild to think about. Okay, so that's the introductory matter. We have still the book itself to go through, but let's stop there and turn to the Graham Robb biography and go through this. Let me give you a couple of highlights. This is a wonderful read. If you are interested in the life of Victor Hugo, which itself is extremely novelistic. I mean, his life is like a novel unto itself. I haven't read any other biographies, but I can highly suggest this, recommend this. 1997, it was a winner of the Whitbread Biography Award. Graham Robb is just very well informed. He is very well researched. He debunks a lot of errors from previous biographies of Victor Hugo, and he seeks to fill in gaps, like where previous biographers kind of threw up their hands or didn't really go anywhere with this or that. He gets in there and fills in those blanks. But it's also just a joy to read. For example, early on in here, this really just got me. He refers to biographers as sympathetic vampires. And for someone, plus his author photo on the back is just hilarious. But for someone of this what do we say? Someone of this learning, someone who's taken on such a large subject, and who's making a career as a biographer. To refer to biographers as sympathetic vampires is that's just amazing. I love that. It's deprecating, but it's also, the vampire part of it's self-deprecating, but the sympathetic part softens it. And I don't know. It's just give you a taste of kind of how he approaches it. But it's not super colloquial either. Like it's respectably written. One thing he says about Victor Hugo is that it should count as one of his greatest achievements that he managed to remain a forbidden pleasure. Sort of like what? Stephen King for us today, even as he became the national poet. So pretty wild, yeah, that he was able to have a foot in both camps. Like, imagine Stephen King as revered by the literati and the masses or whatever. 382. Oh, yeah. He also refers to that glorification of the individual called biography. So I just love it when someone wears their heart on their sleeve. And then get this. He says, with his seemingly unrepresentative life, his egocentrism, his isolation, and his bizarre patchwork religion, Hugo had produced the most lucid, humane, and entertaining moral diagnosis of modern society ever written. Readers should be advised immediately to put down this book and go and read Les Misérables. And there you go. Do it. And stop this video and go and read Les Miserables. 465. This is your last taste, your last goûter before we go through the notes. 485. 465. Memory problems here, people. I'm not a computer. Oh, yeah. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. I'm not going to give you that one. You can find that on your own. All right, so let's get to it. The Biography of Victor Hugo by Graham Robb. By the time he fled the country in 1851, Hugo was the most famous living writer in the world, the founder of two distinct phases of Romanticism. His influence on French literature was second only to that of the Bible. In the long night of exile, faced with a new audience, the ocean, he discovered a new set of identities. The visionary poet who invented a religion and received personal compliments on his work from Jesus Christ and Shakespeare, and the hero of freedom fighters from Serbia to South America. When he died in 1885, he was followed to his tomb by a crowd which outnumbered the usual population of Paris. He mentions Jean Cocteau's quip, Victor Hugo was a madman who thought he was Victor Hugo, which when you hear, now that I know a lot more about Victor Hugo and his work, when I hear that, it makes sense and it rings, it chimes true, right? But Graham Robb calls that a distracting paradox. And so I like that he asserts that right at the beginning, because he's gonna show you throughout the book why Cocteau's amusing quip is actually a distracting paradox from the man, Victor Hugo. Like most writers of his generation, Hugo had the impression of having entered the world in a mythical age. And he sought to extract a means of expression for unacceptable truths from a literature bound by convention. And so earlier when I was saying all that about, cliches and stock situations and characters, and how when you're reading this, it tends to somehow engage with it but rise above it. Graham Robb puts it better here. One of the great things about Hugo as the writer is that he forged a means of expression for unacceptable truths, truths that were being suppressed by the monarchy, by the royalists, by the haves against the have-nots. He sought how to do this in a literature that was bound by a certain convention. So playing by the rules, achieving new rules, or maybe breaking rules by playing by the rules. Maybe that's a good way to put it. Hugo enjoyed a spectacular long-term photographic memory. He once correctly counted, in his mind, the number of buttons on his father's uniform, and, even more remarkable, lived into old age and never told the same story to the same person twice. With Madame Hugo's approval, La Rivière poured Latin texts. This is Victor Hugo's mother and the young Victor Hugo. La Rivière, the teacher, the professor, poured Latin texts into the open mouths so that by the age of 9, Victor could recite swathes of Horace and translate Tacitus, a remarkable feat, even with such an uncluttered syllabus. Meanwhile, as governor of the garrison at Madrid, General Hugo, this is Victor Hugo's father, was busy destroying and exporting significant portions of the national heritage of Madrid, Spain. He oversaw the removal of masterpieces by Velázquez, Murillo, and Goya to the Louvre and the Luxembourg Palace. And then Victor Hugo, who did so much for the conservation of medieval works of art and buildings, thus was the son of a man who stole them and blew them up. So here we have Victor Hugo's father worked for Napoleon, the Napoleon, was stationed in Madrid, and oversaw the theft of their cultural heritage, their greatest works of art, and that were taken and stowed in the Louvre. It's amazing to think that that was his father, the stuff his father was engaged in. And it also gives you a sense of the stature of his family background, which really is all the more amazing in how he turned out. In 1815, so what? Was he born in 1802? I think that's right. Let's go back here. Yeah. So 13 years old. At 13 years old, Hugo's hero was Chateaubriand. Victor Hugo was filling up notebooks with hundreds of lines of verse. How was it possible to revere a patricidal generation which had captured its king and, in the romantic imagination, murdered God? So this was the stuff that Hugo was grappling with. And remember, he started as a royalist, a monarchist. And his nationalist poetry is what first got him recognition. Yet he's looking back to the revolution. And he's just, you think once again of Walt Whitman's statement about, how I am large, I contain multitudes. Do I contradict myself? Yes, of course I do, because, and Hugo was the same way. He contained all these conflicting ideologies in his own person, and he grappled with this for his entire lifetime. His natural preference was for long journeys through forests of images which perpetually defer the final evidence. He had an enormous curiosity coupled with an enormous desire not to know. And I actually wrote that down on a little, well, it's not an index card. It's just some scrap of paper I had around. But I wrote that down. An enormous curiosity coupled with an enormous desire not to know, because that really rang true. That's a great, first of all, I think that's a wonderfully succinct statement about the romantic mindset, the mindset of the Romantics. It also describes me as a reader. I have this enormous curiosity, which keeps me reading, fuels me to continue to stay buried in book after book, but also this enormous desire not to know, to keep things at arm's length, to keep the mystery alive. As early as 1816, in the Pension Cordier, complete alexandrines and even whole poems were forming themselves in the young Victor Hugo's mind while he slept and survived the passage from dream to paper. And he actually complained about this involuntary activity as a nuisance, as if it had been a speech impediment or a tic. So basically, we have here the young Victor Hugo, of course, had to put up with this horrible impediment where beautiful poetry came to him as he slept, and he had to awaken and write it down on paper. You know, just a horrible plague that he had to deal with. Yeah, and that so at 15, yes, at 15, he wrote and submitted poetry that made him instantly famous, and no one could believe that the poet was actually only 15 years old. Robinson Crusoe was one of young Victor's favorite books. At school, he developed an infallible technique, which enabled him to memorize 30 lines of Latin before falling asleep. And then upon waking, he translated them all into rhyming couplets in French. So just a sort of a born poet, right? All right, now we get into Adele. Adele Fouché was only 15 when Hugo declared his love on April 1819. So that would make him, what, 17? So, you know, he wasn't that much older than her. But she was only 15. He declared his love and exacted a similar confession from her. Chateaubriand, in exchange, whoa, I doubt that picked up on the camera, but I just heard wheels squealing like crazy somewhere out there. And I was waiting to hear a big crash, but I guess everybody's okay. What was I saying? Okay, Chateaubriand dubbed Hugo the L'Enfant Sublime, and the name stuck to Hugo well into middle age. So there was definitely a mutual affection there. When Hugo learned that Heinrich Heine had called him a hunchback, he flew into a rage, climbed to a cliff top on Guernsey, removed all of his clothes, and asked his publisher, "Am I a hunchback?" His publisher generously concluded that if heaven had bestowed no other gift on him, he could have earned his living as an artist's model. Oh my goodness. At the Fouchés' holiday home in the village of Gentilly, on the southern edge of Paris, Victor handed her, meaning Adele, a thick envelope which proved to contain a live bat and a terrifying poem about that dark and hairy sister of the funereal owl, vainly seeking the night. This is an obscure but vital moment in the history of French literature. The maiden flight of a new breed of poem which refused to sit dutifully on the page. This is a wild dude. But then, when he was the age of 20, his mother died after a long and expensive illness. This made quite a mark on him. And then it would go on. It would so happen that Leopold, his son with Adele, died at the age of 3 months. So he lost a very young child. But then roughly a year later, the second edition, as Robb refers to her, emerged in the form of a fat and noisy baby. It was a girl, and they named her Leopoldine. For Hugo, a romantic was a writer who refused to imitate. And this is quoting Victor Hugo. Anyone who imitates a romantic poet necessarily becomes a classical poet. The romantic was also a creator who, quite literally, did not know what he was doing. So, Hugo prophetically observed that this had worrying implications for critics. If the final judgment of a work of art lay with each reader's sensibility, the professional critic would be out of a job. And this still has major, ramifications down to this day. With when you start to consider the office of the professional critic in an age where the internet and social media, I mean, look at me right now. We all have a voice and we can all get our opinions out there on the stage. All right, then at 23 years old, Victor Marie Hugo had been made a chevalier of the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor, a civil and military award instituted by Napoleon and adopted by the Restoration. I mean, this is major stuff. He appears to. Oh, this is interesting. Some of Hugo's fantasies may, in any case, be transpositions of actual hallucinations. He appears to have enjoyed unusually detailed phosphine images, the patterns that swim about under the eyelid, or an unusually strong desire to cultivate them, for example, by the Promethean habit of staring at the sun. This might explain the dark patches which had begun to affect his vision, and which led a medical student in 1828 to predict imminent blindness. And of course, on that occasion, Hugo thought of Homer and Milton and started hoping, this is quoting Hugo, started hoping that perhaps one day I would go blind. All right, at 26, his father died of a heart attack. So, a lot of tragedy and loss in an early age, but also a lot of achievement. Just one of those things where in contrast to the 1820s, now thinking about all of this and what he was still able to achieve and how he lived his life, it's both fascinating and appalling, really. So after the death of his father, as Robb says, the Victor Hugo who descended from the necropolis of Père Lachaise, meaning after his father was laid to rest at Père Lachaise, the cemetery that where so many people are there. Chopin, Proust, Wilde, Balzac, blah 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 blah. Had already provided the Romantic movement with the magisterial text, which, according to Gautier, shone in our eyes like the tablets of the law of Moses. Like the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai. He's talking about the Preface de Cromwell, the preface to Cromwell, which was published in December of 1827. This became the codification of the precepts, the hoisting of the Romantic flag. It had a lasting effect. We're talking here about Victor Hugo's book, Le Dernier Jour d'un Condamné. So the last day of the condemned man. It had a lasting effect on Charles Dickens, and Dostoevsky remembered it as he waited to face the firing squad. And further evidence of that book's modernity can be found in the fact that it was a direct influence, of course, on Albert Camus' L'Étranger. According to Sainte-Beuve, and Sainte-Beuve, by the way, maybe we'll find this out as we go on, but Sainte-Beuve was a literary critic of the time who was very taken by Hugo and Adele, as we'll find out. But he wanted to he was fascinated, possibly in love with Victor Hugo. So anyway, according to Saint-Beuve, Hugo often saw ghosts, had terrifying dreams of talking corpses, and after attending the deathbed of one of his young romantic supporters in 1832, was unable to sleep for several weeks. With an increasingly old and nervous government, this had a strong political connotation. Romanticism, defined by Hugo as liberalism in art, was the voice of the younger Republican generation. It stood for freedom, imagination, and a furious fear of being bored. A determination never to grow old and conservative. And this is for sure the underlying tension of the 1834 Paris uprising. Let's see. By the time Hernani, a play that Hugo wrote, reached the end of its run, it was clear that Hugo had been a prophet. Hernani was a literary virus which modified the world around it. Oh, this is kind of funny. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a title that Hugo loathed, an English title that he loathed, blah, blah, blah. It sent thousands of tourists to Paris and the Ile de la Cité, where they were disappointed to find an old church thrust away into a corner. And this bespeaks the power of Hugo's imagination and writing. Nothing in reality can compare to it, can live up to it. So Saint-Beuve had been secretly meeting Adele in churches and rented rooms. So yeah, we find that Hugo wasn't the only one who was unfaithful. So in Victor Hugo's mind, literature was not just a vehicle for ideas. So this isn't just a book of ideas. He saw this as a machine for transforming the world. He honestly wanted to use literature to transform the world and believed truly that it would be done. We've got Adele and Saint-Beuve. Hugo found out about it. They had a little bit of a falling out, but remained acquaintances. Hugo treasured friendship. He didn't react the way that I thought he would, at least according to Robb. Anyhow, going back to Juliette Drouet, let's see. This is her speaking, or being quoted. I consider myself, vis-a-vis yourself, as a stewardess with the job of supervising and keeping house for you as efficiently as possible, and as the governess of our children. There may even be some truth in Alexandre Dumas' claim that Adele had asked him to find her husband a lover. Oh, wait a minute. That's Adele. I knew that something wasn't right. Adele said that, she's the... they had very interesting relationships here. But Adele considered herself a stewardess for Hugo. And perhaps, and I guess Dumas claimed that Adele had come to him and asked him to find Victor a lover. And there's so many different ways you can read that. But Robb says the official line would always be that Victor Hugo was a faithful husband with a close friend called Madame Drouet. They never lived together. She always lived nearby. And, it's one of these things where, and I'm not excusing anything here, but it's just one of these situations where clearly Hugo was well, a special character who needed several different attendants or caretakers for different things, and he had to be split across. And apparently, Adele, to the extent that anybody can be okay with sharing, Adele, maybe she was tired of trying to keep up with certain aspects of Hugo and was like, take that part of him off my hands. I don't know. But like I said, his life was like a novel. The story is that Juliette Drouet was that nice lady who copied out half a century's worth of Victor Hugo manuscripts, helped him to escape to Belgium in 51, and metaphorically kept his bed warm after the death of Adele. Yeah, the great stumbling block in Hugo's past, as his critics always pointed out, was his abandonment of royalism. Because we have to remember the crazy thing with Hugo is, he started off a royalist, supported the monarchy, nationalist, then swung the other way and became a Republican. Hugo devised a persona called Olympio, a rhetorical mirror which enabled him to address himself, or one of his selves, in poems which might otherwise have seemed too personal or even mentally implausible. So, in that respect, and we, in the English-speaking world, we don't, I don't think we're as acquainted with Hugo the poet and his poetry, but in this respect, he was a precursor of someone like Pessoa, where, Hugo had these heteronyms, as Pessoa called them. For the rest of the century, the 19th century, virtually all French writers can be divided into those who were for or against Victor Hugo. Just one of those giants who comes in and creates a divide, a wedge, where people his presence is so enormous that he forces everyone to have to choose a side. Reviewers usually drew a sharp distinction between Hugo's thought and what they saw as the true source of his prestige and popularity. That being his technical mastery, the astonishing variety of poetic forms, a vocabulary larger than that of any writer since Rabelais, an ability to write songs that seemed always to have been a part of French folklore. One face, I love, Robb writes such great sentences. One face of planet Hugo was liberal monarchist, but the other had begun to swarm with the dark currents of mystical socialism. To the outside world, Hugo was becoming more respectable by the year. He was revered as a national figure, the man who had forced Romanticism into the mainstream and whose greatest poems were inseparable in the public mind, from the events they commemorated. So that was the other thing, is his literature was very engaged with historical events, current events as they were then. Young writers talked of laying down their lives for him, just as their fathers had died for Napoleon. The image of the folk hero, Napoleon, was disseminated in the same way as the works of Victor Hugo, and the association of the two was sealed by 1840. At the Collège Royal in Rouen, Gustave Flaubert had been excited by Hugo since the age of 18. He called him a genius of the stature of those who have been admired for centuries. He worked on his novel, entitled Les Misérables, like a convict, but sporadically, often setting it aside and filing it away for years when revolution broke out in February 1848. So there were times where, he let things percolate. Bad harvests, a severe winter during which the Seine had frozen over, Bankruptcies, unemployment, and the scarcity of credit had created misery not seen in France since the Revolution. After 18 years of bourgeois monarchy, the middle classes were sandwiched between a new aristocracy, a tiny clique of fabulously rich individuals, and something quite new, a politically educated working class. They returned to Hugo's home to announce, from the balcony, the formation of a provisional government and, Hugo's idea, a regency. And a man pointed a gun at Hugo's head and shouted, "Down with the Père de France," meaning, Hugo, excuse me, sorry. A regency, it seemed, then was out of the question. When Hugo stood up on the 19th of October, 1849, amidst applause from the left and cries of demagoguery from the right, he used the image he had applied to his own side in June 1848. Victor Hugo had rematerialized on the other side of the barricades, those savages who insult civilization by defending it with barbaric means. So, Hugo is thus also seen as sort of flip-flopping, turning from one side to the other. In the midst of having been in the public eye through three different political regimes. Let's see. At the start of his exile in the Channel Islands, his life was regaining its pleasing symmetry. First, his political career had almost obliterated his imaginative work. Now, the events it had precipitated were about to give rise to the most astonishing artistic rebirth in 19th century literature, meaning Les Mis. Saint-Hélier had a theater, a public library, 7 booksellers, and 9 weekly papers, 5 of them in French, and a grocer on the island owned the complete works of Victor Hugo. So, as Robb says, it was not quite the desert they had feared. But that just shows you that the grocer had his complete works. So this is very crazy. He wrote this political pamphlet or tract or whatever called Napoleon le Petit, the Little Napoleon, about Napoleon III, which is the Napoleon's nephew. And this was quite a sensation. And according to Hugo's daughter, the first balloon book was to be launched from the terrace of the back of their house. And then in parentheses, there is only anecdotal evidence of a rumor that a balloon-born Victor Hugo was going to scatter his books over Paris, presumably a few pages at a time. But anyway, there were people, the book pirating trade was in full swing. And there were people pirating and muling Victor Hugo books all over the place. But anyway, this was an idea they had about putting a couple of pages of Napoleon le Petit in a balloon and floating it from Hauteville House on Guernsey to France. And then there were going to be people stationed there to shoot the balloon down and get the pages. And it's wild stuff, man. With Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, it, meaning his book Châtiment, was the most popular forbidden poetry book in the generations of schoolboys, which included Zola, Verlaine, and Rimbaud. We felt that simply by reading his works, we were contributing to some silent victory over tyranny, remembered Zola. Every schoolboy knew that France's greatest living poet and patriot was Victor Hugo, but they also knew that he disapproved of the nation as it now existed. Going back to channeling the spirit of Shakespeare. Night after night, Shakespeare returned to make minute changes line by line. Fortunately, all in French, because, as Shakespeare now knew, the English language is inferior to French, which is what Hugo told Shakespeare's spirit. If there is madness in the table-turning Hugo, which means he's using this table to channel the spirits, it lies in his presumption that the publication of these texts would found a new religion which will swallow up Christianity just as Christianity swallowed up paganism. And that was quoting Hugo. Built in 1800. Oh, this is talking about the house there on Guernsey. Built in 1800 by an English pirate, Hauteville House had stood empty for the last 9 years. Its previous occupant, a vicar, had been chased out by a ghost. Since then, several other ghosts had moved in. Hugo would soon be having silent conversations in bed with spirits who sang in sweet voices or tapped on the walls in what he assumed to be a kind of Morse code. But here we go. This same guy that was engaging with ghosts and the spirit of Shakespeare and Napoleon and Jesus, apart from Balzac, no 19th century writer produced so many masterpieces in such a short period. On March 2nd, 1861, Madame Hugo left for Paris to have her eyes treated. 2 days later, Hugo boarded the Aquila with Charles, Juliette, and the manuscript of Les Misérables in a waterproof bag. He was going to Belgium for a final piece of research, and his doctor had recommended a change. Since a severe case of anthrax, he had been anticipating an early death. It was the first serious illness he had ever had, and the resulting sense of urgency helped to account for the sheer size of Les Misérables. And in Graham Robb's estimation, because of all of these factors, it's highly plausible that for Victor Hugo, this book might be his last chance to say everything he wanted to say. Who wouldn't want to hear that? Hence why I didn't want an expurgated edition or an abridgment. Les Misérables etches Hugo's view of the world so deeply in the mind that it is impossible to be the same person after reading it, and not just because it takes a noticeable percentage of one's life to do so. To turn Javert, the tenacious respecter of authority, that savage in the service of civilization, into the villain of the piece is to deprive the novel of its dynamite. And I love this. To point the finger at a single policeman instead of at the system he serves. Javert, if you're really paying attention and reading this book, you'll note that Javert isn't a villain. He's a symptom of the system that he serves. And I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that. Dostoevsky was happy to be in prison because, and quoting Dostoevsky, otherwise how would I have found the time to refresh my old, wonderful impressions of that great book? I already read that. So here we go. Robb also points out that Les Misérables is a great pyramid with two roots to the center. The historical drama of the 19th century and the occult biography of Victor Hugo. And that's because dates and events in the novel are very much linked to Hugo's life. For example, the prisoner number 2601. Sorry, I think I said that wrong. 24601. Oh my goodness. Sorry. Am I saying that right? I don't know what I'm saying at this point. I'm sorry. I am still sort of in a Delsum stupor, and my whole face is stuffing up right now. 24601, right? 42601. No, it's June 24601. Yeah, it's 24601 because it's the European writing day, month, year of the 24th of June, 1801. Yes, 24601. That is actually the date that Victor Hugo believed that he was conceived. And he was like kind of strangely obsessed with his conception. And in fact, he famously, even though he was apparently conceived on a mountaintop, he moved the mountain to Mont Blanc, which is the highest part of the Alps. And there's apparently even a sign, like actually a sign there commemorating this conception. Of course there is. This is also yeah, I don't know. I'll skip that. Oh yeah. In that crazy biography of William Shakespeare, at one point, Hugo quickly moves on to his real subject, the greatest geniuses of all time who belong to the region of equals and are therefore above comparison. And he included Homer, Job, Aeschylus, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Lucretius, Juvenal, Tacitus, St. John, St. Paul, Dante, Rabelais, Cervantes, and Shakespeare. Yeah, this was cool. I just marked this because they sat in the Chinese room, which Hugo had designed and which can now be seen in the Victor Hugo Museum in Paris at the Place des Vosges, the place that I've been twice. And it is, you can see it there in the thumbnail on this video, the Chinese room. It's crazy. It's really neat. This is, after all, the great mystery of his political career. Why? When Les Misérables is such a magnificently persuasive novel, are Hugo's speeches so humorously unpersuasive? There was this crazy disparity between his prose and his speeches. The minute global coverage of Hugo's agony proved that he was right to identify Voltaire and Goethe as his closest modern rivals. No other writer had exported his reputation so widely. Hugo's decline was front page news from St. Petersburg to Sacramento. A decree had been rushed through Parliament, restoring the Pantheon to the cult of great men. God had been served with an eviction order. Hugo was moving in. It was the fourth time the Pantheon had been deconsecrated. The procession set off down the Champs-Élysées toward a city which seemed to have been infested by a giant swarm of ants. Over 2 million people, outnumbering the usual population of Paris. And finally, long before he was ensconced in the school curriculum, Hugo had been a one-man education system through which every writer had to pass before achieving originality or sinking into the obscurity of helpless imitation. By the time the centenary of his birth was celebrated in 1902, Hugo had entered the fabric of French life with the force of a multinational corporation. His face was seen on plates, table mats, bottles, pens, paperweights, pipe racks, tobacco tins, cuff links, braces, tie pins, fans, and walking sticks. It stared out of hearths, sphinx-like, on the end of fire dogs, loomed over lampstands, proliferated on curtains and wallpaper. It appeared on stamps, laundry books, blotting pads, and bars of soap, and on decorative receptacles designed to contain all those little knickknacks that mysteriously accumulate. Victor Hugo as his own litter bin. Later, it lent its authority to the lowest denomination of banknote. Most cities in France named something after Victor Hugo, usually a boulevard or a main square. And there is the Boulevard Victor Hugo that terminates to the west near the Marmottan, where I went this past week to see the Monets and the Morisot's. And I had read that there was a huge statue of Victor Hugo there near the Marmottan on the Boulevard Victor Hugo, but sadly, I found that it had been melted down along with many other treasures during the war to be used as ammunition. So that was also just another realization that history isn't just something that we read about. It's something that really happened. But anyway, that is Graham Robb on the life of Victor Hugo. And now we can move into the book proper, Les Misérables. I've got a few different ways that we'll slice this novel. I mean, it's huge, it's vast, it's bottomless, it's endless. So we will, luckily I have my little color-coded note system. So let's slice it in a few different ways. We will slice it by history, so things that have to do with history. We will slice it by ideas and thoughts that Victor Hugo put in here. We'll slice it by religion, by just good writing, so just enjoy good writing. We'll slice it by his thoughts and ideas about Paris, and then we'll slice it, well, why don't we just start with books, because I've got green as books here, and there's like hardly anything. So let's just start there and see what in the world I meant by that. Oh yeah, Monsieur Mabeuf. His political opinion was his passionate love of plants, and especially of books. So he's saying his love of books was his political opinion. Like everyone else, he had his own ist ending, like biologist, psychologist, without which no one could have existed at the time. But he was neither a royalist, a Bonapartist, a Cartist, an Orleanist, or an anarchist. He was a book specialist. I guess I just loved that, and I still do. He had never succeeded in loving any woman as much as a tulip bulb, or any man as much as an Elsevier edition, meaning a certain edition of a book. So here's a guy, this is just your classic character who loves his books and loves, birding or flowers and so on. Although poor, with patience and time and the sacrifices he made, he had the talent to build up a valuable collection of all kinds of rare editions. He never went out without a book under his arm, and he often returned with two. And okay, I remember now. That's the line that got me, because it's so relevant, to me. I love that. That describes me. He never went anywhere without a book under his arm, and he never returned without two. That's so good. Okay, so we sliced it by a little thing about books and reading, because I'm a sucker for anything in books, about books and reading. So let's slice it by something a little larger now. Let's go with history. So those are my orange tabs. Maybe I should give just a little bit about the plot. Like I said earlier, most people know the very, very, very main plot, where you have Jean Valjean. There's this young Frenchman who, they're impoverished. His sister's family is starving. And he steals a loaf of bread and to give to his sister's family. Not even for himself, right? He gets imprisoned. He's in prison for a very long time. It's horrible. The conditions are terrible. He's under the eye of this cruel enforcer, Javert, right? Then he gets out. He breaks his parole which causes Javert to go on a manhunt for him. That's what most people know, right? But there's all kinds of there's another plot with Fantine and Cosette. So what ends up happening, of course, is that Jean Valjean forges a new identity for himself. Well, hold on, let me back up. Oh my goodness, it's so complex. There's so many little pieces to it. My personal favorite character is Monseigneur Bienvenu, which this is the priest who, in my opinion, truly lives out Christianity as defined and depicted in the New Testament. And it's a real challenge to anyone who's a Christian to live in a way that's actually called for. He has mercy on Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean takes this mercy for granted and is on the cusp of being thrown right back into prison. But Father Bienvenu, Monseigneur Bienvenu, shows mercy yet again. So uncompromising, unconditional mercy and love, even though it's been thwarted once or spurned once. This finally has such an effect on Jean Valjean that it changes the whole course of his life. But there's a lot of subterfuge that has to happen because Javert's still looking for him. He forges his new identity. There's this cat and mouse game and close proximity between the two. But now Jean Valjean is, what's his name? Something Madeleine. Monsieur Madeleine. He's running these factories and he's making lots of money. He's high up in the society, right? And there's this factory worker, this young girl named Fantine. And she ends up, she's working herself to the bone so that she can provide for her daughter, her illegitimate child, because of some deadbeat dude who, kind of got her pregnant and then left. She ended up having to give the child to these horrible wretches named Monsieur and Madame Thénardier. They treat Cosette horribly. They're using her just to make money off of Fantine. The money that she sends for the child gets taken by the Thénardiers. But then, of course, Fantine loses that job. She has to end up going into a life of prostitution. It's just terrible. She sells her hair. She sells teeth. It's just miserable, right? In the end, Jean Valjean shows the same kind of unconditional mercy and grace towards Fantine and ultimately Cosette. And then, they end up having to go in hiding from Javert once again. Then that uprising breaks out at the funeral of Lamarck. I don't want to give too much away, but then there's a whole love story, a forbidden love story between Marius, one of the young revolutionaries, and Cosette. Oh man, it's just beautiful. There's so many things going on. Oh man. Yeah. Okay. That's just a little bit of background. Okay. So what are we looking at? We are looking at history. Let's slice this thing by history, which is orange. This man was, let us straightaway utter the dread word, a former member of the convention, with a capital C. And you'll look this up and you'll see that what the convention is this is the revolutionary assembly that overthrew the monarchy and presided over the execution of Louis XVI in 1793. So again, the backdrop here is the historical backdrop to the current events in this is the revolution. And you can sense Hugo grappling with how to reconcile barbarism with revolution. And now, after that disastrous return of the past called 1814, vanished joy. What we're referring to here is where Napoleon ultimately, after Napoleon's rise out of the revolution, he had to abdicate and he was exiled on Elba, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Louis the 18th became king, but of course, Napoleon will come back. And, this is it. In 1815, when ultimate disaster was in the air, when France shuddered at its sinister approach, when Waterloo could be dimly discerned lying in wait for Napoleon. So Napoleon escaped that exile in Elba and then marched on Paris, driving out the king, ruled for 100 days, only to be defeated by Wellington at Waterloo. But was it a defeat for the French? Not so for Hugo. More historical slicing. There is no trivial fact in the affairs of men, no trivial leaf in the vegetable world. The features of the years are what the face of the century is composed of. So the importance of the small things. Paris of 1862, Paris of 1862 is a city with all of France for its outskirts. And honestly, I think that still holds true, at least in the mythology or the minds of most Parisians. There's Paris, which is France, and then there's all the outside parts, the skirts of Paris, as it were. The stirrings of egalitarianism. Okay, hold on. The irresistible penetration of the new spirit is in this as in everything else. Behind this apparent discrepancy, there is something great and profound. The French Revolution. And I love that this succinct statement here. He just says, social suffering begins at all ages. So sort of in tandem with Rousseau, man is born free, yet everywhere in chains. It begins immediately. So maybe man is not even born free. He's just born right into suffering. Napoleon, the man who had been grim at Austerlitz, was cheerful at Waterloo. All right, here we go. I'm going to read a lot of remarks on some Waterloo stuff. The Battle of Waterloo is an enigma. So, like most novels like this, there's going to be some event, some person, something that the author sees as like the embodiment of the main things that they want to convey. Waterloo is certainly one of them here. So it's an important part of the book, and therefore should rightfully be part of your reading. It's an enigma. It is as obscure to those who won. Hold on. It is as obscure to those who won it as it is to those who lost it. For Napoleon, it was panic. Blücher sees only gunfire, or Blücher. Wellington cannot make sense of it. Look at the reports. The accounts are confused. The commentators muddled. Some mumble, others stammer. Of this catastrophe of human genius grappling with divine chance. Wow. So, look, hear that again. Waterloo is a catastrophe of human genius grappling with divine chance. In this event, which bears the stamp of transcendent necessity, the role of men counts for nothing. And one thing that should be pointed out is that Hugo is basically debunking Carlyle and the hero worship, the great man theory of history. He wants to debunk the individual genius, even while he himself is sort of fulfilling the role of individual genius. During a period when Waterloo is no more than a clatter of sabers. Over and beyond Blücher, Germany has Goethe. Over and beyond Wellington, England has Byron. A great intellectual dawn distinguishes our century. And in this advent of light, England and Germany have their own magnificent radiance. They have majesty because they think. So let us discuss Waterloo dispassionately from both sides. Let us render to chance what is due to chance, and to God what is due to God. What is Waterloo? A victory? No. A lottery. A lottery won by Europe at France's expense. Waterloo is the strangest encounter in history. Napoleon and Wellington. They are not enemies. They are opposites. Never did God, who delights in antithesis, set up a more striking contrast, a more extraordinary comparison. Excuse me. So, in Hugo's estimation, the battlefield at Waterloo is a theater that God puts on where he can show something profound about humankind through the opponents of Wellington and Napoleon. Wellington was the Bachem of warfare. Napoleon was its Michelangelo, or Michel-Ange. And this time, genius was defeated by calculation. And this is key for Hugo. I liked this because a couple years back, when I got the chance to go to Gettysburg for the David Foster Wallace conference, on the last day before we drove back home, I went to the battlefield, and it just happened to be a sort of cold and very foggy, overcast morning. So walking around the battlefield was exceptionally atmospheric. And so listen to Hugo talking about the battlefield at Waterloo. The field of Waterloo today has a peacefulness that belongs to the earth, man's impassive pedestal. And it looks like every other plain. Yet at night, a kind of visionary mist arises from it. And if some traveler wanders there, if he looks, if he listens, if he dreams like Virgil before the fateful plains of Philippi, the haunting catastrophe grips him. That ghastly 18th of June comes to life again. The spurious Monument Hill disappears. That undistinguished lion vanishes. The battlefield regains its reality. Lines of infantry ripple over the plain. Galloping charges sweep across the horizon. The terror-stricken dreamer sees the flash of sabers, the glint of bayonets, the flare of bombshells, the monstrous exchange of thunderous fire. He hears, like a dying rasp from deep in the grave, the indistinct clamor of phantom battle. Those shadows are grenadiers. Those glistenings are cuirassiers. This skeleton is Napoleon. That skeleton... Sorry, guys. Jack Skellington. That skeleton is Wellington. All this and no more, and still they clash, and the fighting goes on. And the gullies turn red, and the trees tremble. And there is fury, even in the clouds. All those untamed heights. Hougomont, Mont-Saint-Jean, Frischemont, Papelotte, Plancenoit appear in the gloom indistinctly crowned with tumults of specters slaughtering each other. So, I hope you also get a sense of the power of his writing and the poetic sentiment therein. But this is for sure captures the feeling that I felt there at Gettysburg that morning. Looked at, meaning the battle at Waterloo, looked at from the point of view of its immediate aftermath, Waterloo is meant to be a counter-revolutionary victory. It is Europe against France. It is Petersburg, Berlin, and Vienna against Paris. It is the status quo against any initiative. It is the 14th of July, 1789, otherwise known as 14 Juillet or Bastille Day, attacked through the 20th of March, 1815. It is the monarchies taking action against the indomitable French mob. Man had been both magnified and diminished by Napoleon. All this storm, all this cloud, this war, then this peace, all this shadow did not for an instant, dim the gleam of that immense eye in which an aphid hopping from one blade of grass to another is equal to the eagle flying from belfry to belfry between the towers of Notre Dame. Wow. I think that was actually supposed to be part of just reading the writing. That wasn't historical, but I accidentally read it during our historical slicing of the novel, and I don't apologize. Not at all. Certainly, Napoleon made mistakes during the war in Russia. Alexander made mistakes during the war in India. Caesar during the war in Africa. Cyrus during the war in Scythia. And Javert made mistakes in this campaign against Jean Valjean. So, once again, just one of these writers who, he's a storyteller, he's a philosopher, he's a poet. I mean, and not a historian, but very knowledgeable. And he brings all that to play in this great book. Oh my goodness, so many good things here. We're like, oh my goodness. Yeah, so history. This book, Les Mis, this book is a drama whose main character is the infinite. Man is the second character. The convent, which is a feature of both East and West, of antiquity as well as of modern times, of paganism, Buddhism, Islam, as well as Christianity, is one of the optical devices through which man views the infinite. I think I'm stepping into religious territory here. Let's skip down. Let's just keep going with it. Every time we encounter in man the infinite, well or ill understood, we have a feeling of respect. There is in the synagogue, the mosque, the pagoda, the wigwam, a hideous aspect that we loathe and a sublime aspect that we revere. And that's so well put, because this is the feeling I got walking around inside Notre Dame, inside Sainte-Chapelle, inside the Sacré-Cœur, inside Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Saint-Sulpice. Good in the first stage of civilization, useful in bringing about the reduction. He's talking about religion here. Good in the first stage of civilizations, useful in bringing about the reduction of brutality through spirituality. The monastic regime, though, is bad for nations in their maturity. It's useful in the early education of modern civilization, and cloisters have been a hindrance to its growth and are harmful to its development. So, very critical of religious institutions, notably the Catholic institution, which is part of why his book ended up being banned by the Vatican and burned and so on. So he saw it as useful in the beginning stages of history of civilizations of humans on three different levels, from macro to micro. But then it was no longer useful, and in fact, it was damaging. The leprosy of monasticism. Sorry, guys. The leprosy of monasticism has gnawed almost to the bone two great nations, Italy and Spain. one having been the beacon and the other the splendor of Europe for centuries. And at this present time, these two illustrious peoples are only just beginning to recover, thanks to the healthy and vigorous therapy of 1789, aka the French Revolution. So, wow. I mean, just some serious statements in here, some serious ideas and notions. He saw the revolution as very useful in overthrowing what we could say the abuse of power of the religious institutions of the Catholic Church. And he would also, his last book was called 93, which is 93, short for 1793, which is what wait, am I saying that right? That's the end, sort of the end of the revolution that started in 1789. And it is funny because when my friend there in Paris took me to this American bistro called Coffee Parisien, we walked in and people are eating burgers and fries and chips and salsa and all this kind of stuff. It had like a California vibe in there. They're playing American sitcoms. I think Bewitched was on when we were in there. But then I look over at the bar and this lady is reading. She has it face down, and I can see that she's actually reading 93 by Victor Hugo while eating her cheeseburger with a knife and fork. So still in Paris certainly, but he saw part of it as good, but still it remained to Hugo to figure out how to not let it's just crazy. Power just corrupts, and finding that balance is so difficult because these monarchies, these royalists abuse the power, these religious institutions start abusing their power, but then even the poor proletariat revolutionaries, turn to barbarism, and it's another sort of abuse of power. Oh, I love this. And why did I don't think I meant to mark that as history. But it says to live in a place where you could not possibly be, that was salvation. So well put. I just love that sentiment. Jean Valjean, grappling with the mercies shown to him by Bienvenue. And what is salvation? It's to live in a place where you could not possibly be. Oh boy, here we go. This is where Marius holds forth on Napoleon. So here we are, we're like halfway through the novel, and we're in like 1832, something like that. We're in the 1830s, and we're burbling up towards that, was 1834 revolution. The 1832 revolution, sorry. Anyway, Marius, there are lots of people. This is what Hugo meant by a politically intelligent middle class, and even lower class. People are being taught to think for themselves and that they have a voice, and it's no longer a dictatorship. But there are lots of people are holding forth in cafes, as they still do to this day in Paris. Whom do you admire if you don't admire the emperor? And what more do you want? If you won't accept that great man, which great men will you accept? He had everything. He lacked nothing. His brain contained normal human faculties to the power of 3. He was Justinian in lawmaking. He ruled with Caesar's authority. His conversation combined Pascal's lightning wit with the mighty thunder of Tacitus. He made history and wrote it. His bulletins are Iliads. He combined Newton's mathematics with Muhammad's metaphors. In the East, he left behind words as great as the pyramids. At Tilsit, he taught emperors majesty. At the Academy of Sciences, he challenged Laplace. In the council of state, he held his own against Merlin. He brought soul to the geometry of some and to the pettifogging of others. He was a jurist with lawyers and a stargazer with astronomers. Like Cromwell blowing out every other candle, he went off to the temple to bargain for a curtain tassel. He saw everything, he knew everything, which did not blah 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 blah. What a splendid destiny for a nation to be the empire of such an emperor, when the nation is France and adds its own genius to the genius of that man, to come on to the scene and rule, to march into triumph, to have every capital city mark the steps of your progress. Blah 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 blah. Marius in turn bowed his head. Okay. Oh yeah. This is what makes it so great. I'm skipping a lot because there's so much here, but I hope you're already getting a sense of like that prose. You can almost hear Ahab in here, and Melville. But in all of this lionization of Napoleon, Marius ends with this. Blah blah blah. And greater than this, meaning and greater than Napoleon, greater than what he was able to accomplish, and greater than this, what is there? And one of his comrades, confrère, says, to be free. And what's just so amazing is that after this rhapsody about Napoleon, those three words, just what could be better than all of this, that this great man was who he was, what he did. And then Confrère just says, to be free. And the narrative tells us that Marius in turn bowed his head. That stark and coldly delivered word, meaning freedom or free, cut through his epic outpouring like a steel blade, and he felt it die away inside him. And of course, this will be the turning point for Marius and the events that will ensue. But this is just, it's such a great moment. I mean, this book is just such a great read. All right, moving on. The July Revolution. So now we've got the 2 years immediately following the July Revolution, 1831 and 1832, stand out as one of history's most distinctive and striking moments. And you can see on display in the Louvre the famous Delacroix, Lady Liberty, leading the people. And I got to see it again. Here's some footage of it. I'll put it up here. But it's said that Hugo based his character Gavroche on the little boy there beside Lady Liberty. And Gavroche is this young, street urchin, but he's smart and wily. Great character. So many great characters in this book. All right, we're getting towards the end. We got three history slices here. The work of the 18th century is good and sound. The encyclopedists, led by Diderot, the physiocrats, led by Turgot, the freethinkers, led by Voltaire, the utopians, led by Rousseau. These are four sacred legions. The great advance towards the light that humanity has made is due to them. They are the four vanguards of the human race, directed towards the four cardinal points of progress. Diderot towards beauty, Turgot towards usefulness, Voltaire towards truth, and Rousseau towards justice. You have to appreciate in French history how many great thinkers there were in so many different fields. It could be said that the French Revolution created man a second time by giving him a second soul, his rights. That's well put. I mean, you can hear the political tractatus. No, not tractatus. I don't know. Pamphleteer talking in there. At a given moment. Oh, yeah, this was interesting. He talks about at a given moment, every barricade that holds out, meaning the barricades during that uprising, Any barricade that holds out inevitably becomes the raft of the Medusa. And this is an allusion toward a historical moment where this shipwrecked French crew floating on pieces of wreckage turned to cannibalism, but ultimately ended up on shore and rescued what there was left of them. And this has been commemorated by Géricault, also in the Louvre. In fact, the Géricault commemorating the raft of the Medusa that Hugo is alluding to is hanging right beside Delacroix's Lady Liberty leading the people. So here's some footage of that too. It's just an incredible story. This is more than progress. It is a transformation. Between the old sewer and the present sewer, there has been a revolution. Who brought about this revolution? The man forgotten by everyone and whose name we have mentioned, Brunissot. So yeah, this is where you might have heard that Hugo sort of makes a whole mythology out of the sewers of Paris, and they're used for the plot as well, and for escape and so on. But he also has these ideas of using all of the human waste in the Paris sewer system to fertilize the fields, which will both clean up the sewers of Paris and provide sustenance, meaning that manure will be used to grow food for the people in Paris. Not unlike the way that in Andy Weir's book, The Martian, not unlike the way that character grows his own potatoes there in Mars, stranded on Mars, using his own waste as fertilizer. All right, so we've now sliced this thing historically and by books. Let's look at some of the stuff. Let's slice it by Hugo's thoughts on Paris. And like I said earlier, only Emily Cooper and the show Emily in Paris romanticizes Paris more than Hugo. It says, but they were students. And to say student is another way of saying Parisian. To study in Paris is to be born in Paris. So yeah, Paris is you go there to study to be reborn as a Parisian, as a learned citizen. And again, Paris is the city with all of France for its outskirts. The Parisian is to the Frenchman what the Athenian was to the Greek. No one sleeps more soundly than he. No one is more downright frivolous and lazy. No one more apparently forgetful. Yet in this he is not to be trusted. He is prone to indolence of every sort. But when there is glory at stake, he, the Parisian, is a wonder, capable of all kinds of fury. Is his country at stake? He enlists. Is liberty at stake? He rips up the cobblestones. Beware, his hair bristles with epic rage. His shirt hangs about him like the clammies. I don't know what that is. CHLAMYS. And I didn't jot it down. I must not have taken time to look it up when I was reading this. Watch out. He will make codeine forks of any rue Granetta. If the hour strikes, this working-class Parisian will grow in stature. This little man will rise up, and his gaze will be terrible, and his breath will become a hurricane, and from that poor, puny chest will issue wind enough to reshape the contours of the Alps. Wow. You gotta love the writing. Oh. For Paris is a summation. Paris is the greatest achievement of the human race. This whole marvelous city is a compendium of ways of life past and present. Anyone who sees Paris fancies that he is seeing what underlies all of history, with the heavens and constellations in between. Everything that exists elsewhere is in Paris. So why ever be elsewhere? Try to think of something Paris does not have. Hugo challenges us. Paris is synonymous with cosmos, capital C. Paris is Athens, Rome, Sybaris, Jerusalem, Pantene. And it says that's Parisian argot for Paris. Pantin. It is the epitome of all civilizations, all barbarisms too. Paris would be very aggrieved not to have a guillotine. Paris knows no bounds. No other city has exercised this kind of dominion that sometimes baffles those it subjugates. Paris does more than set the rules, it sets the fashion. Paris does more than set the fashion, it sets the patterns of daily life. Paris may be stupid if it pleases. It sometimes allows itself this luxury, and the universe is thus stupid with it. It has a marvelous 14th of July that liberates the world. Its books, theater, art, science, literature, philosophy are the manuals of the human race. It has Pascal, Régnier, Corneille, Descartes, Jean-Jacques, Voltaire for every moment, Molière for every age. It makes its language one that is spoken universally, and this language becomes the world. It constructs in all minds the idea of progress. The tenets of liberation that it forges are trusty swords for generations, and it is of the spirit of its thinkers and poets that, since 1789, all heroes of all nations are made. But Paris is always showing its teeth. When it's not snarling, it's laughing. To dare, that is the price of progress. This is the distinctive characteristic of Paris uprisings, not to be found in any other capital. What is needed is the city of Voltaire and of Napoleon. Paris has underneath it another Paris, a Paris of sewers, which has its streets, its crossroads, its squares, its blind alleys, its arteries, and its circulation. Of muck, that is, without the human dimension. More of that mythologizing of the Paris sewers. The air taken from above a dung heap, it has been scientifically proved, is purer than the air taken from above Paris. Yet another resemblance between Paris and the sea. He who plunges into it as into the ocean may disappear. And that is wonderfully congruent with the plot. All right, so we've sliced it by history, by Paris, and by books. Let us now slice it by ideas and thoughts. This is on page 1. True or false? What is said about men often figures as large in their lives, and above all, in the fate that befalls them, as what they do. So already we've got the tension of everybody, of juggling your reputation and your actions. How you portray yourself versus, or how you think of yourself and how others think of you versus what you actually do. And a lot of your, in Les Misérables especially, a lot of your greatest actions are going to be those that are largely unseen. So again, that element of faith. The guillotine is the law made concrete. Its name is retribution. It is not neutral and does not allow you to remain neutral. Whoever sees it shudders with the most mysterious of shudders. All social problems raise question marks around this blade. I love that poetic sentiment and that power. All social problems raise question marks around this blade. The scaffold is not a structure. The scaffold is not a machine. The scaffold is not an inert contraption made of wood, iron, and rope. It is as though it were some kind of being with its own sinister initiative. We live in a dismal society. Succeed. That is the lesson dripping down from the corruption at the top. Let it be said in passing, success is a fairly hideous thing. Its false resemblance to merit deceives men. So somewhat ironically, Hugo sought to dethrone that great man theory of Carlyle and to banish the individual genius, right? And I say ironically because that's kind of who he was. He's already catching on to theories here that Byung-Chul Han will talk about in our current day. But anyway, focusing on things like merit, the merits of men and the success we're pushed for in the workplace. Listen to how Hugo sums that up. They mistake for the constellations in the infinity of space the star-shaped footprints left by ducks in the soft wetland mud. Wow. Human thought knows no boundary. At its peril, it analyzes and explores its own bedazzlement. One might almost say that in a splendid reaction of sorts, it thereby dazzles nature. There's a lot in here about this interplay between nature and man, especially the inner man, and tapping into that inner soul of man. If the grain of millet beneath the millstone were capable of thinking, it would no doubt have thought as Jean Valjean did. Release, in this context, from prison. Release is not freedom. You are let out of prison, but you continue to serve your sentence. Of course, because once you've been in the system, your name and thus your future are tarnished. Social suffering begins at all ages, which is what we read earlier. The stirrings of egalitarianism, the irresistible penetration of the new spirit is in this as in everything else, egalitarianism, that is. Behind this apparent discrepancy, there is something great and profound, the French Revolution. The supreme happiness of life is the conviction that you are loved. Loved for yourself. Better yet, or better still, loved despite yourself. And that's exactly what Bienvenue does for Valjean. Hugo had the radical ideas. He had, he wanted to abolish the death penalty, yes. But furthermore, it's almost like he's saying, let us get rid of the whole criminal system, the whole judicial system, and let us just love one another, right? If we could just believe in each other and pour out unconditional love on each other and have faith, then that will change everything. It might take some time, like with Jean Valjean immediately taking advantage and turning, just defaulting to his ways. He then sees that he's truly loved just for himself by Bienvenue, and this changes everything. That's some of the most powerful. I think that's the most powerful part of this book, is the fact that the thought of doing such a thing with no guarantee, because obviously there's no guarantee that in real life Jean Valjean will respond the way that he ends up responding to Monseigneur Bienvenue. If we're kind to someone who wrongs us, there's absolutely no guarantee that they're going to turn around and be a heroic Jean Valjean. But that, again, goes back to one of the big questions that Hugo is making us face is, what are we going to put our faith in? When the population is hard-pressed, when there is a shortage of work, when business is disastrous, the taxpayer, being short of money, is reluctant to pay his taxes, delays as much as possible, and then exceeds the respite granted. And the state spends, in turn, a great deal of money on the costs of enforcement and collection. When there is plenty of work, when the country is happy and wealthy, taxes are paid willingly at little cost to the state. It may be said this is one infallible gauge of public wealth and poverty, the cost of collecting taxes. So, there's a lot in here where shining a light on the sort of tug of war game that the taxpayer and the IRS, let's call it, are engaged in, and how we could achieve a happy balance without either side having to tug at all. It is said that slavery has disappeared from European civilization. This is false. It still exists, but only women suffer this oppression now. And its name is prostitution. And there's a lot we could go in, especially with Victor Hugo's own life, and things that prostitutes decided to do in his honor upon his death and all kinds of stuff. But, the whole point is that he's saying, yes, Europe formally abolished slavery, but it still exists in different forms. True for the whole world, really. Though we shape to the best of our ability the mysterious block of which our life is made, the black vein of destiny is ever reappearing. Wow. I like this. He's talking about traveling. What could be more melancholy and profound than seeing 1,000 objects for the first and last time? To travel is to be born and die at every instant. All things in life are perpetually fleeing before you. Brightness and dark intermingle. After radiance, an eclipse. You watch, you hurry, you reach out to seize what is passing. Every event is a bend in the road, and all of a sudden, you are old. Wow. I really hope, if you're even still watching this video, I just really hope, if you haven't experienced for yourself, you're getting a sense of just how great of a writer he really is. Just a sort of an aphoristic statement here. Harsh prisons make hardened criminals. So again, he wanted that. He's like, if you have this harsh system that's oppressing criminals, beating it into them, that's what they are, that is their identity, then you're basically, you are ensuring that that'll never not be true. You're not even giving them the chance to reform or to change. Sadly, we cannot ignore the fact that at that simple statement, he was a convicted felon. Almost everyone deserted him. In less than 2 hours, all the good he had done was forgotten, and he was nothing but a convicted felon. Oh, wow. Yeah, so this is tying in more thoughts on Waterloo that I didn't read earlier. The inordinate weight of this man was disturbing the balance of human destiny. The individual alone counted for more than the rest of the world put together. These excessive quantities of human vitality concentrated in a single person, the world going to one man's head, would be fatal to civilization if it were to continue. He's talking about Napoleon. The stench of spilled blood, cemeteries filled to overflowing, weeping mothers, these make an unanswerable case. When the earth is glutted, mysterious groanings that emerge from the shadows are heard in the unfathomable abyss. Napoleon had been denounced in the realms of the infinite, and his downfall had been decided. He was an inconvenience to God. Waterloo is no battle. It is a change of front in the universe. And on the heels of that, later he says, just another aphorism so beautiful, so powerful for its concision. He says, war has a terrible beauty. He has all this stuff where he even looks at the government and military spending and how this causes social injustice. And I'll leave that for you to discover. Oh, I lost another thing about Paris here. Paris is a maelstrom in which all is lost, and all disappears inside this earthly vortex, as it does in the vortex of the seas. No forest hides a man as effectively as this throng. All manner of fugitives know this. They go to Paris to be swallowed up. There is salvation in being swallowed up. The police know this too, and it is in Paris they go looking for what they have lost elsewhere. Contemplation, like prayer, is a human need. But like everything the revolution has touched, it will change. And having been hostile to social progress, it will become favorable to it. He talks about the sneerings of Voltaire, who goes so far as to mock the crucifix. This is, for Hugo, a logical inconsistency on Voltaire's part, by the way, for Voltaire would have defended Jesus as he defended Callus. And even to those who deny supernatural incarnations, what does the crucifix represent? The killing of a man of wisdom. In the 19th century, religious thinking is undergoing a crisis. Wow, a crisis. Some things can be unlearned, and rightly so, provided that when something is unlearned, another is learned. No vacuum in the human heart. Some demolitions occur, and a good thing too, but on condition that reconstruction follows. As for convents, they pose a complicated question. A question of civilization, which condemns them. A question of liberty, which protects them. A convent in France in the middle of the 19th century is the equivalent of a parliament of owls confronting daylight. This characteristic of truth is never to be extreme. What need has it to exaggerate? There is that which needs to be destroyed, and there is that which simply needs to be elucidated and examined. Well-intentioned and serious examination, that is a force to be reckoned with. Let us not put to the touch where it is enough to bring light. Liberty is all that is required to transform the monastery into a republic. So he has all these ideas on getting rid of the unnecessary or outmoded monastery system and turning it into a republic. Wow, I forgot about all this stuff. There's so much in here that sounds a lot like Tolstoy. He talks a lot about purging belief and the cult religion of superstition to decontaminate God. He even talks about the Schopenhauer, the force of the will. Oh my goodness. Yeah, he's got a lot of philosophical stuff here in the middle, talking about the empiricists, all the way back to Marcus Aurelius. But he says, philosophy must not be a mere belvedere built on mystery in order to gaze on it at leisure, for nothing more than the accommodation of curiosity. He wants real change. Thales remained motionless for 4 years, and he founded a philosophy. So there is a place for contemplation, but there's the place for application as well. Oh my goodness, there's more about Paris in here that I didn't get to. Well, I'll save that. All right, we talked about that. When these poor creatures are men, almost invariably they are caught and crushed under the millstone of social order. But as long as they are children, being small, they escape. This is like young Gavroche, although he didn't escape, of course, but it's more social injustice. Oh my goodness. So much we could go into here. I like this. This is Marius following when he held forth proudly on Napoleon, but then his comrade sort of deflated all of that. With every thought that occurred to him, his perplexity increased. The ground fell away from him on all sides. He was in accord with neither his grandfather nor his friends, being seen as headstrong by the former and reactionary by the latter, and he realized he was doubly isolated from old and young alike. And I think a lot of us will come to these points where we suddenly realize that we're not really even sure where we fit in terms of ideology or thinking or sides or whatever. That, we kind of can't really side with anything that's offered to us. I love this. The embryonic work of the future is one of the visions of philosophy. So philosophy is not just for men of leisure, the armchair philosopher. It's for men of action to change the future. God makes his will visible to men in events, an obscure text written in a mysterious language. Men produce instant translations, hasty, incorrect translations full of errors, gaps, and misconstructions. Very few minds comprehend the divine language. The most discerning, most calm, most profound decipher slowly, and by the time they come up with their texts, the task has long been completed. There are already 20 translations in the public arena. Each translation gives birth to a party, and each misconstruction to a faction. And every party thinks it has the only true text, and every faction thinks it possesses the light. Wow. Very well put. Very prescient. And I hope you're also getting a sense of how much is in here. Because some people may approach this. We got a 1,300 page book, and approaching it with the knowledge of the core story that we have just through cultural osmosis, you may think like, what all is going on in here that makes it so long? Well, everything. It's Victor Hugo on everything, and written in beautiful language, powerful language, living language. It's a text that's very much alive. At the same time, a certain amount of daydreaming does you good, like a narcotic in small doses. It sedates the sometimes severe fevers of the toiling intellect and produces in the mind a cool and gentle mist that softens the over-harsh contours of pure thought, fills in the gaps and intervals here and there, creates cohesion and smooths the sharp edges of ideas. But too much daydreaming drags you down and overwhelms you. Woe to the intellectual kind of worker whose thinking completely subsides into daydreaming. So, everything in moderation, I suppose. Somewhere in here, he refers to Balzac, a contemporary, as a profound observer of the human heart. Then he's got a whole essay on slang that's just wonderful. Within which he also takes on metaphor. Secondly, metaphor. It is characteristic of a language that wants to say all and to conceal all, to be rich in imagery. So again, an enormous curiosity coupled with an enormous desire not to know. Metaphor is a riddle in which the thief plotting an attack. This is so great. Listen, metaphor is a riddle in which the thief plotting an attack, the prisoner planning an escape, takes refuge. And no language is more metaphorical than slang. He's got a whole essay on rioting and revolution. And I love the way he refers to it, a gradual buildup of electricity, a sudden spark, an uncontained force, a gust of wind. This gust of wind encounters individuals who think, minds that dream, souls that suffer, passions that burn, wretchedness that howls, and carries them away with it. I'll leave you to discover some of the ideas and so on. But he does talk about, he muses on civil war. And what does it mean? Is there such a thing as foreign war? Is not all war between men war between brothers? War is defined only by its objective. There is no such thing as foreign or civil war. There is only unjust war and just war. And I love how that really takes out the us versus them of it all. You know, the subjectivity of it. He's thinking about equality here. It is, in civil terms, all who have the same aptitude, having the same opportunity. In political terms, all votes having the same weight. In religious terms, all consciences having the same right. Equality has an agency, free and compulsory education. So very much in line with Tolstoy, who would write his own school books and run his own school for a time. And they both see education as so important to civilization. This little, again, another little aphorism. Lovers have no need of other people. Beautiful. It's one of those things, the more you think about it, the truer it is, the deeper it is. Now that the young man was here, the old man faded into the background. Such is life. And this is Jean Valjean realizing that his adopted daughter, Cosette, has fallen in love with Marius. As a girl dad, that line really hit me hard. Now that the young man was here, the old man, the dad, faded into the background. Such is life. Doesn't disappear, and needs to be all the more present, I say. But you get the sentiment. All right. Love is the only ecstasy. All the rest is weeping. To love or to have loved is enough. Ask for nothing more. There is no other pearl to be found in life's shadowy convolutions. To love is an achievement. So, as the English romantic said, is it better to have loved and lost than have never loved at all? For Hugo, yes, it is absolutely better to have loved and to have lost. Absolutely. Love is the pinnacle. We can slice this thing one more time. I know this video is getting quite lengthy, but the book is quite lengthy, and the material inside is just so complex and beautiful. Maybe what I'll do now is I'll just slice this thing by some cases of what I found was just really, really good writing to round this video out. He is in the monstrous waters. He has nothing underfoot anymore but shifting and treacherousness. The billows torn and chopped by the wind surround him hideously. The heavings of the deep overwhelm him. All the watery raggedness thrashes round his head. A mob of waves spews over him. Blurred openings half devour him. Every time he goes under, he glimpses precipices filled with darkness. Frightful, alien vegetation seize him, bind his feet, draw him towards them. He feels that he is becoming the deep. He is part of the spume. The waves toss him from one to another. He drinks bitterness. The craven ocean is furiously intent on drowning him. Hugeness toys with him as he perishes. It seems as if all this water were hatred. Nevertheless, he puts up a fight. He tries to defend himself. He tries to keep above the water. He strives. He swims. He, this puny force, immediately exhausted, combats the inexhaustible. That is the greatest metaphor for this entire book. And just so well written. He feels simultaneously buried by those two infinities, the ocean and the sky. The one is a tomb, the other a shroud. This heavenly kindness he countered with pride, a fortress of evil, as it were, within us. He had the indistinct feeling that the priest's forgiveness was the greatest assault and most tremendous attack he had ever experienced. That if he resisted this clemency, the hardening of his heart would be definitive. That if he yielded, he would be obliged to renounce that hatred with which the deeds of other men had filled his soul over so many years, a hatred he relished. That this time he had to vanquish or be vanquished, and that the battle had been joined, a colossal and decisive battle between his own wickedness and that man's goodness. Among all these glimmers of understanding, he reeled like a drunken man. For him, there was no middle ground anymore. After this, if he were not to be the best of men, he would be the worst. But to put it another way, he would now have to rise higher than the bishop or fall lower than the convict. If he wished to become good, he would have to be an angel. If he wished to remain wicked, he would have to be a monster. Draped under the axle was a huge chain worthy of a fettered Goliath. This chain conjured up not the wooden beams it was meant to haul, but the mastodons and mammoths it might have harnessed. There was something suggestive of the forced labor camp about it, but a forced labor camp on a Herculean and superhuman scale. It looked like the loosed chain of some monster. Homer would have tethered Polyphemus with it, and Shakespeare, Caliban. The setting sun commingled with this joy, and there was nothing to match the charm of this capriccio of chance that had made a cherubim's swing of a titan's chain. Listen to this poetic sensibility. Fantine threw her mirror out of the window. She had long since left her small cell on the second floor for a garret with a latch door under the roof. One of those attic spaces with the ceiling sloping down from the floor that you kept banging your head against. The poor can no more reach the end of their room than the end of their life without having to stoop lower and lower. The mind's eye can nowhere find more brilliant splendor and more tenebrous gloom than in man. It cannot set its gaze on anything more fearsome, more complicated, more mysterious and infinite. There is a spectacle greater than the sea. That is the sky. But there is a spectacle greater than the sky. That is the inner soul. To create a poem about the human conscience, were it only with regard to a single man, only to the least of men, would be to amalgamate all epics in one superior and definitive epic. Conscience is a confusion of chimeras, of desires and temptations, the furnace of dreams, the retreat of thoughts that shame us. It is a pandemonium of sophisms. It is the battleground of the passions. Probe, at certain moments, the ghastly pale face of a human being immersed in thought, and look behind it. Look into that soul, look into that obscurity. There, beneath the outward silence, are battling giants, as in Homer, tumultuous dragons and hydras and phantom hosts, as in Milton, visionary vortices, as in Dante. What a solemn thing is this infinity that every man bears within him, and against which he measures with despair the wishes of his brain and the actions of his life. And to be honest with you, even though there's a lot left to go, I'm going to end right there because I think that's just so powerful and so beautiful. And I really don't want this video to go on too much longer. But that is why I love Les Misérables and why it has left such a decisive and profound mark upon my life. And you will do yourself a disservice by not reading it in your lifetime.